Hey, can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Hey, yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Great to meet you guys.
Hey, good to meet you. We're gonna start in like
Hi.
a couple minutes.
All right. So Alicia, and then what's your name?
Lily.
Lily. Hmm. And Lily, I'm assuming you're the one related to Lexi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell.
I'm
Nice. How old are you guys? Or like what year are you guys?
going into my junior year. I'm 15.
Okay,
And I'm gonna be a senior, so I'm 16.
nice. And
Or
so
wait, yeah, wait. I just turned 17. I forgot. Just turned 17. I'm 17.
you got to be proud of that. You gotta own being 17. 17's a good age.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, after 18, each birthday is not quite as special. Like there's the big milestone birthdays, but after 18,
Yeah,
it's
but
like a
21
little.
is cool though. 21.
Yeah, the 18's big, then 21, then I think 25 and 30, and then it sort of goes by decade.
Yeah.
I'm 30, so I haven't experienced that quite yet, but yeah, I'm turning 31 here in a couple weeks, and I'm not as excited as I was about turning 18. That's for sure. But yeah, let me know when people are here and I can start.
Okay, great. We can start at like 7:05. Okay, we can get started. There's some other people that are coming, but we can start now. So, hi guys, welcome to today's BioX Tech webinar. This webinar will be hosted by Dr. Baldwin, who will dive into his PhD research and his experience with biotech startups. Dr. Baldwin received his BS in electrical engineering from the University of Arkansas and his PhD in biomedical engineering from USC. He now works at a Nuvo developing neurostimulation devices to address untreatable conditions. And I discussed with Dr. Baldwin, and this will be a 20 to 30 minute presentation, and we'll take questions after the presentation. I'll be the moderator, so you can raise your hand in the Zoom features, or you can type your question in the chat and I'll answer it on your behalf. So Dr. Baldwin, you can begin.
Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I know that the title of this was How to Start a Medical Device Company. I had big plans to put together a nice, almost like classroom lecture presentation on my experience with medical device startups, but unfortunately I'm dealing with a pretty bad sinus infection, so just didn't have the time or energy. So you guys get to see my PhD work. I am happy to take any questions you have about more of the business side of the medical field. And also, I guess if you're interested, I'm always happy to come back at a later date. But at any point during the presentation, feel free to ask lots of questions. All right, do you mind enabling screen sharing?
Yeah, it should work now.
There we go. All right. So like the introduction said, my name is Alex. I received my bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Arkansas all the way back in 2013. And there I focused a little bit on IC design. I didn't do much biomedical because honestly, at the time, Arkansas did not have a biomedical engineering department. So most of my work was very pure electrical engineering work. I interned at a company that they did little tiny power drives for things like the F-35 or electric cars. So that was a lot of fun. Spent most of my time though hiking around and having fun in the woods. For my PhD though, I came out to the University of Southern California here in LA. That time I focused on medical devices and some of the work that I did you're about to see here. Another thing I did during my time at USC was I actually graduated from another program that paired PhD and MD students together to specifically like find needs and start startups in the medical device field. So I got to go through a little bit of both the medical school curriculum as well as getting a crash course in business. And I found out that I really enjoy that. So that path naturally took me to medical device startups because even if you're an engineer in a startup, you kind of get to be a part of everything, assuming it's like a 5 or 10 person startup. What's up?
I think it's just someone's mic unmuted by accident.
Okay, thought it might be a question. Yeah. So after my PhD, me as well as my PhD advisor and a couple other people came together in founding a company to commercialize some of the research that we did for the specific disease called hydrocephalus, which I'll discuss in just a second. I worked as part of that group for about 1.5 years. I did a lot of fundraising and business development and sort of a lot of the fundamentals of the business side of setting up this company, whereas I had done more of the engineering and research side during my actual graduate work. I ended up leaving in late 2018 and I joined a Nuvo where I am now, which is how I know Alexis, who's your leader's sister. Right now at a Nuvo, we are working on some neurostimulation therapies. The one that we're more public about at the moment is the spinal cord stimulator for people who are paralyzed. So this works on people that have will hopefully work on people that have spinal cord injury and allows signals from the brain to go past the injury and sort of innervate the arms and hands more. It sort of gives a boost to the signals that are still intact when you have a non-complete injury. It's been a very interesting journey over the last 3 years here. And if y'all have any questions at the end, I'm happy to talk about how I've seen this company grow from, a very small, scrappy company to a real, to a company that's actually produced and gone into clinical trials with product, because it's been a lot of fun. But before I do, now you get to hear my PhD research. So I mentioned hydrocephalus. This is a disease that is, to be honest, surprisingly common in the US, even though you almost never hear about it. The literal meaning of hydrocephalus is water on the brain. And what it refers to is when the cerebrospinal fluid that's produced in the ventricles, which are those the blue structures in the little rotating brain phantom over there on the right, when those fill up with too much fluid, and so that ends up pushing the brain out and actually causing pretty significant neural damage. You can see here's a child who has hydrocephalus. This child, spoiler alert, has just gotten treatment, which you can see the little tube running down the side of his head. On the right over here, you can see an MRI of somebody who has hydrocephalus, and you can see just where all this black stuff, there should be brain there, and instead it's just fluid. If this happens, this usually happens in newborns, and before successful treatment was developed, everybody died. Like there was like a 6-week lifespan of children with hydrocephalus. That's because I guess the root cause of hydrocephalus is the brain produces fluid as it normally does, but there's no drainage path. And so the problem gets more and more pronounced, and then eventually there's no neural tissue left. Luckily, here's some demographic info. So like I said, 1 out of every 1,000 kids about develops hydrocephalus. And luckily, thanks to the treatment I'm about to talk about, over 1 million people are alive with hydrocephalus today. And the treatment is almost barbarically simple. You just stick a tube in the brain and you route that tube down through the neck, under the skin, into the abdominal cavity where the fluid can drain and a normal pressure in the brain can be restored. These tubes are called shunts. They involve, a proximal catheter that goes into the brain itself, a valve that's placed on the skull, and then the distal catheter, which goes down to the abdomen. Shunt failure is very common. It turns out when you put something in the brain doesn't like it, and it likes to fight back. And so you'll have scar tissue and encapsulation of the tube until all of those holes you can see over here on the little picture, they just clog right up. It's a problem because once that clogs up, the disease returns. At that point, the brain starts filling up with fluid again and compressing neural tissue. And when it does that, especially once the skull plates have fused, once the patient gets a little bit older, it's very, very difficult to even know what's happening until the patient's in serious risk. Here's just another little slide showing the different parts. These valves are actually really fascinating. There's been a lot of work done on different valve designs that are either based on pressure or based on flow rate. Some have magnets in them so that they're adjustable. The doctor can use a magnet to sort of adjust it above the skull. I think the fascinating thing is because this is a relatively low volume product, most of these valves are very handmade. There's like little ruby or sapphire spheres in them that block or unblock the tubes, and seeing them made and seeing just, I guess, how intricate of a device they are really gives you some respect for the people that develop these things. There's a company called Meethke in Germany that developed the first ones, and they make some pretty good models to this day. All right, here's some more pictures of shunt failure. You can see over here how things just sort of grow into those holes. Looks kind of nasty, but unfortunately, that's what happens when you put something in the body. The natural tendency of the body is first to attack and try to dissolve it, try to break it down. And if that doesn't work, it's try to build scar tissue so that it's separate from the rest of the body and can't damage you. Most of the time, this works great, whether you have a splinter or you have, I don't know, something more serious like a bullet stuck inside of you. But when you have an actual medical device, it's actually one of the biggest issues with having something work for long periods of time. And unfortunately, these devices need to work for the rest of the patient's lives. So as you can imagine, anything that could help either predict shunt failure, prevent shunt failure, or even just let the patient know when their shunt has failed before they get this brain damage, that would be incredibly helpful. You can see here a little cartoon of like normal shunt, nasty shunt. Okay, here's a slide just describing the different ways that shunt failures are diagnosed today. It's pretty hard. Once you have the skull plates fusing, so once you're about 1 year old, you can't really look into the brain easily. The normal ways to do it, like MRI or CT, aren't precise enough to see whether the little tubes have actually clogged. You can see if fluid is built up and if the brain's compressed, but these patients already have somewhat abnormal brains or abnormal holes in there. And so unless you're with the same doctor for years and years, and you have, maybe an image every 6 months to compare, sometimes it's very difficult to tell whether or not this is normal variation or whether there's an actual shunt failure. Things like a shunt series, which is just a whole body X-ray, they're good to find out if part of the shunt is actually broken in half, but that's a relatively rare phenomenon. It's more common for them to just clog. And then a shunt tap over here on the left, that's actually by far the most common thing, where they just poke a needle into the shunt through your skull or through the skin above your skull. And they either try to push some fluid through to see if the fluid actually goes in, or they pull fluid out and see if there's any sort of infection or any sort of blood in there. So this problem actually was not something I discovered in grad school. Before I even joined USC, my PhD advisor, Dr. Ellis Meng, she was working with some physicians on another project, and they mentioned that, oh, we really wish we could know when our patients shunt fail. We really wish we could know, when there's a shunt failure, or that like we can send the patients home, and then if the parents are panicking and the patient has a headache, say, we can just check it and say, oh no, your shunt's fine, or oh, maybe you do need to come in. So this was sort of a need that was brought to me and the other PhD students in our lab, and we tried to develop different technology to monitor these shunts and to let the patients know when their shunt is in danger. Here's a couple slides, I think, describing the concept. So what we tried to do is put some sensors in line with the shunt and have them wirelessly connect to a receiving unit, either a phone, an iPad, or just a little device next to the bedside, with the idea that then, whether they were home or in the hospital, a doctor could look on a cloud-based database and could tell what's going on in there. We tried to put multiple sensors in this little sensor unit. At first, we were thinking, oh, we can just measure pressure, right? The pressure rises, that means that the shunt has failed. One of the, I guess, maybe not a problem with that approach, but one advantage of using other sensors is we could tell, hopefully, when the shunt is in the process of failing. And so we would avoid having a case where where pressure builds up and where the patient is already in danger. Another thing is that if the shunt is blocked upstream of the sensors, then pressure in the shunt might not accurately reflect pressure in the brain. So we decided to add this flow sensor, which is what I'm going to talk about. That was one of my projects, as well as a patency sensor, which is just the fancy medical word for is it open or not. So if a catheter is patent, that means that things can flow through, and if it's not patent, that means it's clogged. And we used actually, my buddy Brian used a really fun technique to measure electrical signals through the outside of the inside and directly tell if the shunt was clogged or not. But I'm going to talk about my flow sensor. So one of the things that I've been dancing around a little bit is that even though pressure buildup can be very, very dangerous, and even though the brain is producing more fluid than the patient can get rid of, the amount of fluid the brain produces is actually very, very small. And so if a shunt does fail, a lot of times it can be weeks or even months before the patient notices through external symptoms like headaches or dizziness or cognitive decline. What this means is that if we're going to measure flow through this shunt, we're going to have to measure incredibly tiny flow rates. So the velocity of flow through these shunts we figured out is somewhere in the range of hundreds of microns per second. So a millionth of a meter per second. And that there's not a lot of sensors out there that can measure something that slow with the precision that we needed. The technique that I centered in on for trying to measure that is called thermal flow sensing. So these sensors do exist, and they're used for various things like, some are used in air conditioning units or in industrial processes. The way that they work is they essentially create a tiny amount of heat in the fluid, and then they use temperature sensors downstream to measure where that heat goes. The idea being, if you have a bit of hot fluid and then it passes by temperature sensor A at time X and temperature sensor B at time Y, you can just look at the time and then you know how fast the fluid's flowing. That's sort of the time of flight method. There's also a method where you just have a constant heat and you look at how hot the temperature gets upstream versus downstream. You can kind of see how the heat is pushed one way or another, which is the calorimetric method over here. So one of the problems with this method, or maybe not a problem, but one of the ways we had to adapt it to hydrocephalus is because hydrocephalus is so slow, heat travels incredibly fast through fluid or through water. And so we needed to make sure that whatever method of thermal flow sensing we used or whatever technique we used would be good in a regime where the heat reaches the sensors a lot faster than the fluid does. And so I guess to put it in scientific terms, the thermal transfer is highly conductive and not very conductive. Next couple slides just describe how traditional thermal flow sensors are made. These are usually made for air, and they're made by essentially creating a little bridge in air between two microchips made of silicon, and then you can manufacture temperature sensors and heaters on top of that. I'm not going to go into the details of these, but you can see over here on the right-hand picture, there's a little island. And the reason why there's an island is because silicon itself actually conducts heat very well. And so you need to minimize the amount that the parts containing the heater and the parts containing the temperature sensor are touching. That's what these trenches are for. Another problem with temperature sensors that are commonly made, another reason why you can't just take those and put them in the body, is that materials like silicon or like the materials that they use to print on top of silicon are very corrosive. And so if you put them in the body, they might work for a day, but after a month or so, they'll start to actually just dissolve. And this is just sort of a summary of like some other different failure modes, but essentially the sensors that are commonly used cannot just be transferred directly into the body. Luckily, the lab I was working at has developed some really interesting new techniques based on some new materials. So Perylene is, you can think of it as saran wrap. It's a type of very thin plastic that is, it's biocompatible, and people have shown putting it in the body for years at a time without it degrading. Platinum as well, not only is it fancy and shiny, but it's biocompatible. It can be placed in the body. It's commonly used. And then instead of the materials printed on these silicon devices to act as heaters and temperature sensors, we just measured essentially what was going on in the fluid itself. As you're going to see in the next slide, fluid is very sensitive to changes in temperature, and the amount of electricity that can go through fluid, because electricity in fluid is sort of the way it travels is through the actual salt particles or the salt ions in the fluid itself. If everything is hotter, there's more jiggling around of the ions and more movement of the water molecules, and so the salt ions can get from one side to the other a lot quicker. And it's incredibly sensitive. And usually people look at this as an annoyance and try to filter it out. But we wanted to actually use that phenomenon and use the fact that electricity passes faster whenever temperature is higher to make this temperature sensor. This is more technical stuff about how and what frequency to measure electricity in fluid. Turns out you need about 10 kilohertz or higher in order to make measurements. Happy to nerd out about stuff if y'all want, but I'll keep going. And this is just looking at different materials. The gray ones are different metals. TCR stands for temperature coefficient of resistance. So this is how much the electrical resistance or the electrical conductivity changes with temperature. You can see metals, those are usually used for like really common temperature sensors, like a meat thermometer. Those are really low. These polysilicon and germanium, these are used in the flow sensors that I showed, the IC or the silicon flow sensors. And these are pretty high, but they won't work in the body. And then if you just look at how much fluid itself changes, it's on the same order as these semiconductor materials in yellow, but there's no worry about corrosion in the body, not hurting the body, or about it dissolving, because you're essentially using the body itself. I guess I've been talking really fast. So before I keep going, any questions from anybody? All right. This slide, I'll skip through this briefly. This is just a little overview of that material, Perylene, the saran wrap-like material, and the different techniques our lab developed in order to actually make complex structures out of it. This was somebody else's PhD, and they did a great job. I think she's working at Medtronic now, actually, making glucose monitors. So here's a quick version of this is essentially the proof of concept first version of the flow sensor. For a heater, I just used platinum and made a little windy trace there so that, just like a wall heater or toaster, the very thin wires heat up when you put electricity through it. And then electrodes placed just, I think this was 500 or 750 microns, so less than a millimeter downstream. All of this was on this see-through saran wrap like Perylene, and I put it right in the middle of the hydrocephalus shunt, so that there wouldn't be any heat going into the walls. All the heat would go into the fluid. One advantage of that, I think I talk about it in a little bit, but one advantage of that is that I was able to use very low temperatures, because obviously you don't want to have something in the body heat up. You don't want to burn somebody. You don't want to make somebody uncomfortable, and you definitely don't want to hurt brain tissue. So I only used like a 1 degree Celsius temperature increase, whereas the sensors you might see in an air conditioning unit, say those use more in the order of 50 or 60 degrees Celsius. So those get really hot, but because of the sensitivity of the body's fluid itself, I was able to lower that temperature a lot. And you can just see here sort of the transduction mechanism, meaning how, like the details of how I do the measurement. This is essentially resistance, or how difficult it is for electricity to pass through the body on the y-axis. And so once the heater's turned on, the difficulty level drops. It becomes easier for the heat for the electricity to transfer, and I'm able to measure that. Let's see, there's just some simulations showing what happens. Essentially, I was using the fact that at steady state, so 10, 20, 30 seconds after turning the heater on, the final temperature is very different at different flow rates. But I didn't want to measure for 30 seconds, so I would measure for like 2 seconds and then just take that initial slope, and I was able to correlate to what the flow rate was. Little cartoon of a test setup, just what I did in the benchtop. Here's some actual data. This is characterizing how much heat I needed based on how much electricity I had to put into that heater. And it turns out I was able to, with this orange line, I was able to do that with only 1 degree Celsius change in temperature, which is very helpful for patients, or very helpful for making a medical device. And then here's sort of my quote unquote hero picture. This is the one that you put in a publication where it's like, oh, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's flow velocity. Here's the thing that I'm measuring, and they make a line-ish. Some details. I did a bunch of other tests that I won't bore you guys with. This is something that as a PhD student, you always have to put this table somewhere in your paper, because this is essentially why what you did matters. What you did has got to be better than somebody. So this is just saying like, oh, I'm better than most of these guys, and I have a lower temperature. Feels a little egotistical, but also if what you're doing as a PhD student or as a researcher in general isn't advancing the state of the art, then you need to maybe do something else. You've always got to try to be pushing and trying to improve things. Right. As a summary, I guess to summarize the whole presentation, there is this disease, I guess to step back a bit, there was a need in the clinic, and as a researcher for this short period of time, my job was to try to make a technology that could meet that need. And this flow sensor was just one part of the larger project, but it was my contribution to actually meeting this need and to actually helping people in the clinic. This work is ongoing through that startup that I mentioned, Sincere. There's been some ups and downs with the company. Like I said, I left a couple of years ago, and they've sort of pivoted into more of a digital health regime, but they are still trying to actively find needs and address them in the marketplace, or I guess in this case, in the hospital. And it's fun watching their progress. And of course, I'm still on good terms with them. Also, that was, in case you guys are thinking career-wise, or like, what is a PhD even? I'm happy to go into more details on that, but that was only one single project that I did as part of my PhD. I also helped make this pressure sensor. I wasn't lead on the project, but I got to contribute and help manufacture and test these guys. I started a clinical study, actually. There's patients that need, especially who get brain trauma, who need to reduce their pressure very quickly, and they use this external drain to do so. And so we were able to put those sensors on the external drain. I got to start that clinical study, but I didn't really get to finish it. I graduated and I passed that off to another PhD student who took the reins on that and got some actual human data. And then on the side, I worked on some wireless sensors for catheter patency, like I mentioned earlier, and also for like glucose. for glucose monitoring, and then some fun flexible sensors that were more of an R&D exercise than finding an actual need in the marketplace. But I got a good little GIF out of it, so I'm proud of it. So yeah, that's the slides I've got for y'all today. This was sort of the conclusion slide to my entire PhD work, where the thesis of what I did was essentially, right now we have sensors where you go into the doctor's office and they do a test, whether that's measuring your pulse ox on your finger, measuring your heart rate, or even doing an MRI. It's a one single point test, and that data does not accurately reflect how people live and how people's bodies fluctuate throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. So one of the things that I really believed in, and I still believe, is that if we can get more detailed data, and especially data that's on the order of like every hour, every minute, we can both learn a lot more about how the body works, as well as really make medical care a lot more precise and a lot more focused on what people actually need. And it's been fun to see, especially since COVID started and since I graduated from my PhD in 2018, how a lot of this has sort of come true. There's more and more health things built into smartwatches. Smart rings are a big thing. Actually got one of those recently, and it's fun to play around with. I think that the promise of it, of having this sort of constant monitoring of your own biosignals and the alerts that let you know if something's wrong, and to so you only need to go to the doctor when you need to, and then also you don't miss something that could potentially be life-threatening. That still is under development, and that's a much harder problem than it looks like at the surface. But it is something I think would be really valuable to a lot of people, and it's something that I hope to see happen. So with that, I'm happy to answer any and all questions y'all have, and I'll turn it back over to Lily.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So we'll get into questions now. You can raise your hand, which I see one now, or you can type in the chat. Alicia, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I heard that you have quite a bit of experience with the whole medical device startup aspect of the medical device field. Can you please share your experiences with that a bit more?
Yeah, and I figured that'd be something y'all would be interested in, so I was hoping to have more of a, I guess, formal presentation on it. Yeah, like I said, I did this program during my PhD where I went through essentially the first stage of starting a couple different startups along with some MD students. Then I participated in co-founding the startup Sincere, and then I came on for my current company Nuvo as I was the fourth employee to come on board. So I got to see the startup grow from a very scrappy research group to a real company. I'd say to try to condense a huge amount of knowledge into just a couple sentences, I think the most important things about starting a company, especially in the medical device or in the medical field, is number one, you need to have a real need. This is not a field where you can make a fun little app that distracts people, or where you can make a cool piece of consumer electronics. I really believe that any company in healthcare needs to start with what does the patient need, or what does the doctor need, or what actual unmet need exists in the marketplace or in the clinic. And for that, you really need to go talk to people. You need to talk to patients, doctors, nurses, business people who work at hospitals, anybody you can get your hands on. Like, if you're looking to start a company, you need to really go out and talk to people a lot, and not just your friends, or not just the person that whose dad is a doctor, but like a broad range of people, so you can validate whether this is a serious issue or not, or just one person's annoyance. The other thing about a medical device startup that's especially difficult is figuring out who your customer actually is, because there's a lot of cases where the person who has the need is not the person that is going to be paying you, right? In a normal company, there's a couple different sort of business models. Like, maybe you directly give somebody a physical thing, and then they give you money, and they're your customer. Or maybe Walmart buys your energy drink, and then Walmart sells your energy drink to people. And so Walmart would be your customer in that case, because they're the ones directly paying you. But that's so you wouldn't necessarily want to tailor your product towards what people would want. You would want to tailor your product towards what these big box distributors need. When you get into medical products, that issue of like, who do you actually tailor your product to gets much more complicated, because you have the patient, the doctor, many times multiple different types of doctors. You have business people in the hospital. You have nurses who, depending on the situation, may or may not have any power or any influence. And then you have insurance companies and the US FDA or the regulatory agency, and all of them are different stakeholders in your product. So yeah, I would say the biggest things are figure out something that everybody needs, or that, I guess, figure out something that there is an actual need for in the marketplace, not just something you think is cool. And two, try to understand who all of your stakeholders are and who would really be the person that could move the needle. Like, if you wanted to sell your product to a hospital, or if you wanted to get your products in patients' hands, who do you have to convince? Is it the doctor? Is it the CEO of the hospital? Is it the patient themselves? I think that's a little bit different for each product. See a couple more hands. So maybe Ida, go for it. Or
Hello?
sorry, I think maybe Kevin in the chat was the first one.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I had a question about how long it takes to get your medical device actually approved. Like you were mentioning the FDA and everything.
Yeah, that's a great question. The FDA puts medical devices into 3 categories. So class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 1 devices are like things like tongue depressors or like a surgical mask. They're things that there's no risk, there's little or no risk to a patient if something goes wrong. And for those, the path to market can be incredibly quick. I can't put a number on it, but like maybe a year, something like that. There's class 2 devices, which are a little bit more serious. And for those, like our device right now, the spinal cord stimulator, that's considered a class 2 device because it doesn't go inside a patient, it just goes on the outside of the patient. And so it's not considered as risky as a class 3. And for that, it depends on if you're just copying somebody else's device essentially, or if you're making something new. If you're copying somebody else's device, you can shortcut the process a little bit by asking the FDA to consider your devices. The term is substantially equivalent, but considering it, say, oh, we're just making what these guys did. We just maybe have a better design or better user interface, or we're making it cheaper, or we're making it friendlier. And the FDA can take a look at your testing data and can say, oh yeah, these are basically the same thing, aren't they? For that, I'd say it can be done quickly, but it still takes several years, maybe 2 or 3 years. For a device that's brand new, you have to go through both pilot clinical studies, meaning you have to do a small study making sure your device is safe, as well as a pivotal study, which is where you actually prove to the FDA that your device is effective, that it does what you say it does. And for that, it can take a lot longer. I would say it usually takes 1 to 2 years to actually develop the device. And then it can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years of clinical trials before you get approval. Again, though, it sort of depends on your device, because if there's something where you can test it and know if it works or not within a day versus something that you have to test it for a year, that can really change. That can change how long your approval pathway is. And then class 3 devices, which are like pacemakers or very serious things that go inside the body, usually those take forever. I'd say 10 years minimum.
Thank you. So
A quick follow-up, or do you want to move on to somebody else's question? Ida?
Oh no, I was saying thank you. I really appreciated you're very informative.
Oh, no problem. I see in the chat, Kevin asked a question. When you started your startup, what was your biggest motivator to work hard? The answer to that is I hadn't started therapy yet, so I had a lot of angst and I was trying to get it out. And I'm not even joking about that. No, I mean, so part of it is I got to see some kids get these shunts implanted and how brutal of a procedure that is and how sort of traumatic, I guess it is, for both the parents and the children. I really wanted to do something to help them. A big part was ego driven. I wanted to be somebody who co-founded a successful company. Part of it, I'd say probably the biggest part for me was I just wanted to know what it was like. Like you can read books about starting a company. You can listen to podcasts, you can watch interviews. There's so much you don't know until you actually try. And even though I was only there for a year and a half or so, I learned a huge amount about myself during that process. And so I'd say that was probably my biggest motivator. Now, what was my motivation to work hard instead of just being lazy? I don't know. I feel like that's a deeper question, but I'm lucky enough to be very sort of intrinsically motivated, where I sort of work hard at everything, whether I want to or not. Or I guess I work hard at everything once I make the decision to do something, I'm all in. And I think part of that was probably developed throughout the PhD program, which is it can be a very lonely and sort of soul crushing thing, because it's just sort of you on your own, and your success or failure entirely depends on what you do. There's no coasting. There's no really relying on others. Though of course you have friends and you have colleagues, but your projects it's sort of all you on whether they succeed or fail. And so I think that, and sort of going through the ups and downs of that program, really helped me find that place inside me that I could go to when I needed to push and work hard. All right, I see Katie's hands raised, and then Kevin, I'll get back to you.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure hearing about your research. I think you said at the beginning of your presentation that you were starting to do research into spinal cord injuries. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I have a family member who unfortunately is half paralyzed because of one. I think that one thing that's been really clear is just how there just remains such a lack of, sorry, somebody's at my door. There just remains a lack of, sorry, can you give me 1 second?
No worries. All right, I've got a good answer for you, but I'll go to Kevin while you're answering the door. What was different about starting to start up yourself than watching interviews and reading books about it? Anything you never expected? So the biggest things for me, or I guess maybe the biggest thing that sort of hit me like a refrigerator, or like a truck full of refrigerators, was just how much politics and ego and dealing with big personalities it takes to start a company. There's sort of a reason why people like Elon Musk or like other people who are quote unquote assholes can start companies and be very successful. And it's because once you are in any sort of position to do that, you have to really have a lot of inner strength to avoid just being crushed by a lot of other people who want to either take advantage of you or just who think their ideas are better than yours, and they just want their ideas to work maybe at the expense of the actual company, or just people who don't respect you and think you're wrong. And it's a really tough balance, because like as a younger person, yes, I was younger when I was 26, but I considered myself a young person. But yeah, as a young person starting a startup, there was so much I didn't know. And all I wanted to do was sort of absorb knowledge and learn from these people that were a lot more experienced than me. But now looking back, I realized I also needed a lot more confidence and a lot more ability to sort of direct others who maybe were much more established in their career or who did have more experience, and sort of, I guess, maybe keep the vision and keep the core beliefs behind the company more solid, while also, getting this other information from people and adapting to it. And it's a really tough balance, and it's one that, quite frankly, I wasn't ready for. So I guess for me, that was the thing that was most different. It's like developing a product, making the technology work. Even things like what I just said about the FDA, or like, going through manufacturing. Those are all things I think that can be learned a priori. But the dealing with people and I guess the leadership and the forming a team and really, motivating and inspiring others, that's something I believe you have to learn through practice. All right, Katie, back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, basically, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what kind of research you're doing into spinal cord injuries.
Yeah, no, and honestly, I hope your family member gets to use, ours or maybe one of our competitors' devices someday. That research is going on here at Nuvo, and that is unfortunately I can't give specifics just because we're still startups, so we're just got to keep the secret.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
But we are using this external electrode patch and this external electric stimulator to try to first focus on giving people who have quadriplegia, who have like full body paralysis, movement of their arms and hands. But we do think that the same technology can be used for using their legs, for trunk control, even for some of those sort of less fun to talk about things like sexual function or bladder and bowel dysfunction, or there's even some, you might know, Katie, but there's some very serious problems a lot of people have with regulating their blood pressure. And at this company, we're really trying to design technology, to design systems that can address all of that. Having said that, it is a slow process, so I can't mail you a device today. I wish I could, but I guess Lily, you should annoy Lexi and find out when we're actually, going live with this stuff, and then make sure Katie knows. Or if there's a clinical trial for, I guess your family member is tetraplegia, or it's, I forget the word now, but leg only paralysis.
No, they're half paralyzed. It's kind of a weird injury. Like their entire left side is paralyzed.
Oh, okay, like from stroke.
Breaking their neck.
Ooh, yikes. That is, I did not know that was a thing.
Definitely
Wow.
anything to happen. But no, it's super cool to hear that you're doing research into it, and I wish you the best of luck with that.
I didn't know there was sort of you could be spinal cord injury, paralyzed left side or right side. Actually, I think our device could be really good for that. I might bring that up. It's something that would require a lot more research and to figure out, but I'm gonna put some thought into that. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much for speaking to us.
I actually was wondering, in like a job that's so innovative and inventive all the time, when you're always kind of trying to be better or think out of the box, do you ever kind of hit like roadblock, like a writer would have writer's block or an artist would have artist block, like just a stunt in creativity?
So the answer to that is yes. Thanks, Aisha.
Isha, yeah, perfect.
Isha. Nice. So I guess I'm going to take a step back, and I want to address your original premise, which was in a job that is so creative, and those other very flattering words you used. The truth is, the job that I have, and even when I was part of this team starting a startup, it was 90% just grinding it out and doing things that made you miserable all day. And then 10% of it was the fun creativity, but there's a lot of just making it work. And I, on paper, right, I've got a PhD, I'm a fancy scientist, but I spent half of the day today just using a hot gun and a soldering iron to take teeny tiny things off of boards, because that's what, it was just very mechanical, boring, and honestly very annoying work, but it's what needed to be done. And I think that if you're going to be part of a small team building something new, there's a lot of going through the grind work, and you have to get in a mindset where you can kind of enjoy that, and you can understand that it's all in service of a larger cause. Back to your actual question, which is like, what happens when I need to be creative about something, but I just can't? And yes, that happens a lot. I actually, especially going into my PhD, I would not have considered myself a very creative person. In terms of problem solving, I was very good. In terms of actually coming up with new ideas, I think I was very bad. And the reason for that is I didn't have any practice. Creativity, like anything, is a skill that you can learn, you can practice, you can get better at. The practice that I used, and that I still go back to sometimes when I need to come up with a new idea, is essentially I go somewhere quiet, I take a notebook out, and I start making lists of really bad ideas to solve my problem, or just really bad ideas in general. And I try to think, what are the silliest, stupidest ideas I can come up with, and just write them down, not just think in my mind. I need to put them on a different piece of media. And I want to get 10 or 20 or 30 just really bad solutions and just think them all through. And that process has really helped me, help sort of get my mind flowing. It reduces the stress behind, I have to come up with the perfect idea, because that sort of stress and anxiety is the opposite of creativity. it can help for the grind part, but like if you need to be creative, you need to get rid of some of the anxiety and just, I don't know, coming up with silly solutions to problems really has helped me.
I have a question, another one. So is there maybe any class or something that you learned that you didn't think was going to be helpful, but was actually really useful in the whole, not only the medical device process, designing the medical device process, but also the business aspect of things? Like something unexpected that was really useful for you?
So this is not going to be a class. Also, I want to give a little caveat as we keep talking. Like, I am not an expert on any of these things I'm talking about, and I definitely am not somebody who knows everything. So it's totally possible all my answers would be different in 5 years. Keep it in mind. There's a lot of paths to get from A to B. Anyway, back to Alicia's question. This isn't a class that I took, but it's something that I've been learning more about recently that's really helped me in my career, or I guess in other parts of life, and that's learning more about investing. I hate investing. I'm very risk averse. The stock market seems like it's just gambling. I just completely stayed out of all the crypto stuff. I think that's all very dumb. Sorry if you guys are into that. I think it's really, I'm not a big fan of it, beyond some very limited use cases. But the more I sort of listen to people who are investors talk, or the more I look into like what investors actually want and look for, especially as part of my job, I've looked into, talking to investors who want to invest in these companies, these startups. I've gotten a lot of valuable things out of there in terms of learning how to think about risk and learning how to evaluate a bunch of different options when there is no good option or no right answer. And sort of how to weigh things out when you have to make a decision now, but you're not going to know for maybe a year or 5 years or 10 years what the result of that decision is. And so even when I'm building, like when I'm actually engineering a new device or trying to fix an old device or something, stepping back and thinking in terms of risk and risk mitigation and thinking like an investor can be helpful, or it gave me some useful, I guess, mental models.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, I think I probably have time for one more question.
I guess I'm gonna ask the last question. So many of us are in the middle of getting ready for college and future careers, or even high school. So if you had to give us or your high school self any advice to be successful, what would it be after your experience with everything?
Oh man, I've experienced in everything. I didn't know that. I'm a lot more qualified than I thought. I feel like whatever advice I would give my high school self would not necessarily be best for you guys, just because things have changed a lot in the last 20 years in the world and in the US. And I think I would be a very different person if I was graduating high school today. The advice that I would give myself in high school would probably be some combination of like, I guess, don't be afraid to get professional help for things, and maybe some encouragement to like both physically and mentally, like go search out different people, or even I guess career wise. It's like, it's important to find mentors. It's important to find people that can help you, that you can be really sort of genuine with, and that you can ask questions and get good advice from. And that's something that I always sort of wanted, but I never really pursued or never really knew how to pursue. But once I started, this is even after grad school, once I started like surrounding myself with people like that, it really was helpful in a lot of different ways in life. And this can take a lot of forms. Like during my PhD, I developed some autoimmune stuff, and for the longest time I was like, no, I got to power through this. I'm going to be good. So just actually taking the step of going and seeing a doctor, and then once that first doctor sucked, going and seeing more doctors and pushing until I actually found a diagnosis was important. On the mental side, had a similar issue with therapists, where the first therapist was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, and then took 4 actually before I found somebody that clicked and acted less like a doctor and more like a personal trainer for your mind or for your emotional life. And that's been very helpful in some capacities. And then just I was always afraid of calling up friends or calling up people who are farther ahead in their career than me, or just, you know, people I met at a conference or wherever, and like asking them genuine advice. But when I started forcing myself to do that, it universally they ended up being good interactions. Like I've seen absolutely zero downside from reaching out to someone you barely know and asking them a question. And you know, part of that is you've got to, you know, you can't be a dick, and you've got to ask them an intelligent question, and you've got to show at least some interest in their life. But like everybody that I've ever asked advice for has been ridiculously, you know, kind and willing to step in and give somebody younger than them, or somebody who, you know, is trying to learn more about them some really good life advice. And you know, I wish I would have done more of that sooner. So I guess the big picture takeaway is making cool technology is good. Make sure that you get a lot of hard skills along the way in terms of like, you know, maybe get an engineering skill or a science skill, learn how to build something. But in the end, it's all about people.
Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation and responses to all the questions. So yeah, thank you so much. Do you have any concluding remarks before we leave?
Good luck, guys. And Lily, feel free to share my email with people if they want to ask any more questions, or yeah, now and in the future, if you ever want to talk about anything, just let me know. But yeah, it's been fun. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. This was super
Thank you.
insightful.
Thank you.